I woke up to the smell of hospital disinfectant, and the sound of my own heartbeat on a monitor, and the first face I saw wasn't my husband's worry. It was his lawyer's signature already printed at the bottom of a stack of papers. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He asked if I had a pen. 3 days later, he married another woman. He thought he'd taken everything from me. He had no idea what he was actually walking away from. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 32 years old, a major in the United States Army, and for 11 years I built a life out of discipline, the kind of discipline that teaches you to keep your face still, even when everything inside you is falling apart. I learned that lesson fully on a Tuesday morning in a recovery room at Walter Reed, 3 hours after surgeons finished repairing the damage a training accident had done to my spine. The anesthesia hadn't fully cleared. My mouth was dry. My ribs ached with every breath, and the fluorescent lights above me felt too bright, too loud in a way that light shouldn't be able to feel. I remember blinking slowly, trying to bring the room into focus, and thinking, he'll be here. He has to be here. Ethan and I had been married for 6 years. Whatever cracks had grown between us, I still believed that when it mattered, when I was lying broken in a hospital bed, my husband would walk through that door with flowers or coffee or just his hand looking for mine. He walked in with a folder. Not flowers, not coffee. A manila folder, the kind you get from an office supply store, tucked under his arm like he was here to close on a house. He didn't sit down. He didn't touch me. He stood at the foot of the bed with the fluorescent light catching the side of his face, and he said the words so plainly, so evenly, that for a second I thought I'd misheard him through the fog of the drugs. I filed for divorce. I stared at him. My throat was still raw from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery, and I couldn't have argued even if I'd wanted to. But it wasn't just my throat that had gone silent. It was something deeper, something that had been quietly closing itself off for longer than I wanted to admit. I looked at him, at the man I had married in a small chapel in Georgia, with my father crying in the front pew, and I felt strangely calm. Not devastated. Calm the way you feel in the seconds after you already know the outcome of something, and you're just waiting for the world to catch up. He set the folder on the rolling tray beside my bed, right next to the plastic cup of water I hadn't been able to drink yet. He opened it himself, flipping through pages like he was giving a presentation to a client. He told me in that same flat real estate voice he used when he was closing a deal that he'd be keeping the house, the Denali, the furniture we'd picked out together at that overpriced showroom in Alexandria. He said it like he was reading off a checklist, like none of it had ever meant anything beyond its resale value. "You just need to sign," he said. "That's all this is." I remember looking down at my hands, an IV taped into the back of one, a hospital bracelet loose around my wrist, and thinking about how many nights I'd sat up with him when his real estate deals fell through, how many times I'd driven 4 hours back from a deployment prep just to be at his mother's birthday dinner. None of that seemed to exist in the room with us anymore. It had all been quietly erased, replaced by a folder and a pen. And then he said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about how little he'd ever actually seen me. "You only make $7,000 a month." He said, not unkindly, almost like he felt sorry for me. "You'll never recover financially, not from this." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him about the trust accounts, the patents, the seat on a board he'd never once asked about in 6 years of marriage. I didn't explain that the number on my Army pay stub was the smallest fraction of what I was worth on paper or otherwise. Something in me, call it pride, call it exhaustion, call it the particular clarity that comes right after surgery, when the drugs strip away everything, except the truth, decided that I didn't owe him an explanation anymore. So I picked up the pen with my good hand and I signed. I signed the house away. I signed the car away. I signed away 6 years of Sunday mornings and shared toothbrushes and a life I had built around loving a man who in that moment couldn't even manage to ask if the surgery had gone well. He took the folder back, thanked me like I'd done him a favor, and walked out of the room without looking back. I lay there afterward staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to my own monitor beep in steady, indifferent rhythm. I didn't cry. I kept thinking about a sentence, turning it over and over in my mind like a stone in my palm. "If that's what you believe, Ethan, then let it be what you believe. 3 days later, while I was still in a hospital gown doing laps around the ward with a physical therapist holding my arm, Ethan Morgan married Vanessa Cole in a small vineyard ceremony 40 minutes outside the city. Someone sent me a photo, though I never asked for it. He was smiling in it, the kind of wide, easy smile I hadn't seen directed at me in over a year. Vanessa wore ivory. She was laughing at something just outside the frame. I looked at that photo for a long time. And then I put my phone face down on the hospital tray and I closed my eyes, and I let myself rest. Because somewhere underneath the ache in my back and the quiet sting of being so easily discarded, there was something else. Something Ethan didn't know was coming for him. Something he had never once thought to ask about in 6 years of marriage, because he had already decided who I was and what I was worth. He was about to find out how wrong he'd been. To understand why Ethan never saw any of this coming, you'd have to understand the kind of marriage we actually had, not the one we showed people, but the quiet architecture underneath it, the parts nobody else was invited to see. I met Ethan Morgan at a mutual friend's barbecue in Virginia Beach back when I was a captain, and he was still hungry in the good way, still building his real estate business one open house at a time. He had this easy charm, the kind that made strangers trust him within minutes, and I liked that about him. I liked that he could walk into a room and make everyone feel like the most interesting person there. I didn't know yet that the same charm that drew people to him would later be the thing he used to avoid ever really looking at me. From the beginning, I kept my finances separate and quiet. That wasn't about hiding anything from him specifically, it was about how I was raised. My father was an accountant who believed money should be seen rarely and discussed even less. And when my Uncle Frank passed away 4 years into my marriage, he left me something nobody expected: a minority stake in a small defense technology firm he'd helped found decades earlier, back when it was 3 guys in a garage in Huntsville. Alongside that came 2 patents I held jointly with him, systems related to logistics and predictive AI that, as it turned out, the Army itself had eventually licensed for testing. I didn't understand the full value of any of it at first. I just knew Frank had trusted me with it, and I wasn't going to be careless with what he'd built. So I found a wealth management firm through an old service buddy, set up a trust, and let the money grow quietly in the background of a life that otherwise looked exactly like every other military family's life. A modest 3-bedroom house, a Denali with too many miles on it, grocery coupons clipped out of habit more than necessity. I never wore anything that would have given it away. No watches, no handbags, nothing that said, "Look at what I have." Partly that was Army culture. You don't flash wealth around people who are living paycheck to paycheck on a staff sergeant's salary. But partly, if I'm honest with myself now, it was a test I never admitted I was running. I wanted to know if Ethan loved the woman standing in front of him or the version of success he assumed I represented. He failed that test slowly in small ways, long before the divorce papers ever showed up at my hospital bed. There were nights early in our marriage when I tried to talk to him about money, not to boast, but just to be honest, the way a partner should be. I remember one dinner, maybe our 3rd year together, when I started to explain that my income wasn't only the number on my LES, that there were other things, accounts and holdings that belonged to both of us in spirit, even if the paperwork kept them separate for legal reasons. He cut me off before I even got the sentence out. "I know how military pay works, Rachel," he said, waving his fork like he was swatting away a fly. "You don't have to explain your paycheck to me." I sat there with my mouth still open around the beginning of a sentence he'd never let me finish, and something in me just closed. Not dramatically, not with tears. It was quieter than that, the way a door doesn't slam shut so much as it settles, click by click, until one day you realize it's been locked for years, and you don't remember exactly when that happened. After that, I stopped trying to explain. I told myself it didn't matter, that a marriage wasn't a balance sheet, that love should be able to exist without either of us fully understanding the other's finances. But underneath that generous reasoning was something more honest and less comfortable. I had a husband who had already decided who I was, and he wasn't interested in updating the file. He started pulling away around year 5. I noticed the phone he angled slightly out of view during dinner, the client meetings that ran later and later into the evening, the new cologne that didn't smell like anything he owned. I'm not a fool, and I've spent over a decade reading people under pressure for a living. I knew in the specific quiet way, You know something you're not ready to say out loud yet, that he was seeing someone else. I found out her name eventually, Vanessa Cole, a client he'd sold a lake house to the year before. But by the time I had confirmation, I was 6 weeks out from a training exercise that would leave me on an operating table, and I was too depleted physically and emotionally to fight for something that had already quietly ended on his side. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a full career, a marriage that had stopped being reciprocal, and the growing awareness that you're the only one still trying. I didn't have the reserves left to save us. So I let it happen. I let him drift, and I focused on healing my body because at least that was a fight I still had some control over. When my lawyer, an old family friend named Diane Whitfield, reviewed the divorce filing Ethan's attorney had drawn up, she read through it twice at her desk, then looked up at me over her glasses with an expression I'll never forget, somewhere between disbelief and quiet amusement. He listed the house and the vehicle as marital assets, she said, tapping the page, and asked for nothing else. Rachel, does he know what's actually in your name? I shook my head slowly. He's never asked. Diane set the papers down, folded her hands, and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with knowing exactly how this story was going to unfold. Well, she said, he's about to discover something interesting. The weeks after the divorce were by every outward measure a triumph for Ethan Morgan. He posted the wedding photos to Facebook within 48 hours, Vanessa in her ivory dress under a string of vineyard lights, Ethan in a linen suit with his tie loosened just enough to look effortless. The captions were the kind designed to be read by an audience starting our forever. Sometimes the best things come when you finally choose yourself. I saw it because a mutual friend from our old church group sent it to me, not maliciously, just with the caption, "Thought you should know before you heard it somewhere else." I looked at it once, felt a strange distant ache that had more to do with nostalgia than heartbreak, and set my phone down. Vanessa, from what people told me, wasted no time making sure everyone knew she'd won. She wasn't cruel exactly. She was the kind of woman who mistakes volume for confidence. She talked about me at parties before she'd ever met me, calling me the boring army wife to people who still had my number in their phones. She joked that Ethan had finally traded up, that he deserved someone who understood ambition, instead of someone who spent a decade in fatigues playing soldier. Word travels in small circles, and ours was smaller than either of them realized. They went to Turks and Caicos for the honeymoon. Vanessa posted a photo of her feet in the sand next to a champagne glass with the caption, "New chapter, new life, new husband who actually provides." Ethan liked it within a minute of it going up. I know because someone screenshotted it and sent it to me with 3 separate texts of outrage on my behalf that I never asked for but appreciated anyway. What none of them knew, what Ethan himself didn't know, standing in our old kitchen bragging to his buddies about keeping the house, like he'd won some kind of negotiation, was that the house had never been the asset that mattered. He kept the physical shell of our marriage. The mortgage, which was underwater by more than either of us wanted to admit after the market correction the year before. The Denali 3 years old with a check engine light that came on intermittently, and that he'd been putting off having looked at. The furniture, half of which I'd bought second-hand, and refinished myself on weekends when I was home between deployments. He'd kept the props, the set dressing, everything that photographed well and meant almost nothing on a balance sheet. What he hadn't asked for, because he didn't know it existed, was the actual architecture of what I owned. The minority stake in the defense firm my Uncle Frank had left me, which had quietly tripled in value over 4 years, as the company won 2 federal contracts, nobody outside a small circle of investors had heard about yet. The brokerage account that held it, along with a diversified portfolio, my wealth manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nkamelu, had built for me with the kind of patience that compounds over a decade into real money. The 2 patents still generating modest but steady licensing income from the very branch of the Army I served in, a detail that, had he known, it might have made him laugh at the irony, or might have made him furious that he'd never once thought to ask what logistics systems consultant meant on my old fellowship paperwork. None of it was hidden through deception. It was simply never volunteered because he'd never once created the space where volunteering it felt safe. and under the law, because every bit of it predated our marriage, or came to me through inheritance and intellectual property, I held independently none of it was subject to division. My attorney Diane made sure the settlement reflected that with surgical precision, the house, the car, the joint checking account. Nothing more. I didn't fight for a larger share. I didn't need to. I let him walk away certain he'd won because in his mind, winning meant keeping the things he could see. I remember Diane asking me once over coffee after the paperwork was finalized whether I wanted to make sure he understood what he was missing before he signed everything. She said it delicately professionally, the way lawyers do when they're offering you a form of justice but want you to choose it yourself. I could make sure the language in the settlement makes it clear what your full net worth is, she said. Some people want their ex to know exactly what they lost. I thought about it for a long moment, stirring my coffee slowly, watching the steam curl up and disappear. No, I said finally. Let him find out on his own. Let it come from the world, not from me. There was something in me that needed it. That way, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of dignity I wasn't willing to give up even in the face of everything he'd taken. I didn't want my worth to be a weapon I brandished at him on my way out the door. I wanted him to simply meet the truth naturally in his own time, the way he should have met it years earlier if he'd ever cared enough to look. So I signed my part of the settlement, closed that chapter as quietly as I'd lived through it, and went back to physical therapy, back to work, back to the long, unglamorous process of rebuilding a body that had been through surgery and a life that had just been legally rewritten in under 20 minutes at a courthouse in Fairfax County. I didn't think about Ethan much in those first days. I assumed if I thought of him at all that he'd go on living exactly the small, self-satisfied life he'd chosen, and that our paths would simply drift apart the way most divorced couples do, through obligation at first, then indifference, then nothing at all. I didn't know yet how quickly all of that would change. On the 4th day after the settlement was finalized, an envelope arrived at Ethan's new address. Official letterhead, a federal seal in the corner. It wasn't addressed from me or from Diane or from anyone connected to our divorce at all. It was the first thread in a fabric that was about to come completely undone. Ethan told me the story himself months later in a conversation neither of us expected to have. But piecing it together with what I already knew from the paperwork that eventually crossed my desk, this is how that morning actually unfolded. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter for almost an hour before he opened it. Vanessa noticed it first. She was the type to notice mail to open bills before her second cup of coffee, out of some anxious habit she'd carried from a childhood where money had always been tight. She turned it over in her hands, saw the government seal, and called out to Ethan from the kitchen, only half paying attention. "Something came for you. Looks official." He opened it, standing at the counter, still in his undershirt, coffee going cold beside him. It was a formal notice from a federal contracting oversight office, addressed to him only because his name had appeared tangentially in a due diligence file connected to a company he'd never heard of. The letter was dense with the kind of institutional language that takes 3 reads to fully understand, but the gist of it, once it landed, hit like a dropped weight. A defense technology firm was undergoing a routine ownership and compliance review ahead of a new contract award, and his own name had surfaced, because as the letter explained almost as an afterthought, his former spouse held a documented equity stake in the company, and his own recent loan applications and personal financial disclosures filed during the last 2 years of our marriage had listed household assets in ways that no longer reconciled with public filings now coming to light. He read it twice, he told me later, without understanding a single sentence of it beyond the words, "Your former spouse holds equity." The phone rang before he'd even set the letter down. It was his bank, the one holding the loan on a rental property he'd used to expand his real estate portfolio 2 years earlier, a loan he'd personally guaranteed, in part using financial statements that had included my income as part of our household's combined resources at the time, back when we still filed jointly. The loan officer's voice was polite, careful, the way people are when they're about to deliver news they know will not be well received. They were reviewing the file. There'd been a discrepancy flagged in an audit. given the recent divorce and the sudden absence of the income that had been used to qualify for the original terms. They needed updated documentation, and soon. Ethan hung up, he said, feeling the first genuine spike of panic he'd felt in years. Then the second call came. His attorney, the one who'd handled the divorce, calling not out of concern but out of professional caution, informing him that a routine title search on the house standard procedure, now that Ethan was refinancing it into his name alone, had turned up references to trust holdings and intellectual property assignments connected to Rachel Morgan that hadn't been part of the divorce disclosures, and asking delicately whether Ethan had been fully aware of his ex-wife's financial position at the time of settlement. By the third call, this one from the IRS, regarding an inconsistency in a joint filing from 2 years prior, one that had claimed deductions based on income levels that public records now suggested were significantly understated. Ethan was sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, the phone pressed so hard against his ear that Vanessa said later she could hear the tinny voice from across the room. She stood in the doorway watching him. She told a mutual friend afterward, the color draining slowly out of his face like something being poured out of a glass. "What is going on?" she kept asking. "Ethan, what is going on?" He didn't answer her at first. He was too busy connecting a set of facts that had been sitting in plain sight for years, facts he'd simply never bothered to look at, because he'd already decided long before any of this exactly what kind of woman he'd married. There was a real estate deal, too, the one he'd been chasing for months, a mixed-use development outside Richmond that would have been the biggest commission of his career. His investment partner on that deal, a man named Carl Denning, who'd been quietly running his own background checks as a matter of standard practice before finalizing a 7-figure commitment, called that same afternoon to say he was pulling out. Carl didn't accuse Ethan of anything outright. He simply said, in the careful language of men who've decided not to burn a bridge, but also don't intend to walk across it again, that certain representations Ethan had made about his personal financial standing during their early conversations didn't seem to hold up, and that he thought it best they part ways before any documents were signed. Ethan told me later that this was the moment it truly landed. Not the bank, not the IRS letter, not even the divorce lawyer's careful question. It was Carl's voice, flat and final, telling him that his credibility, the thing he'd spent 15 years building in an industry built entirely on trust and reputation, had just quietly evaporated because of assumptions he'd made about a woman he never bothered to actually know. Vanessa's panic surfaced almost immediately after that call ended. She'd married him, believing in her own words later that he was about to be a millionaire once the divorce settlement cleared, and his real estate career kept climbing the way he'd always promised her it would. She sat across from him at the kitchen table that evening, her voice climbing in pitch as she asked the question that in hindsight should have been asked years earlier by someone else entirely. "I thought she was broke," Vanessa said. "You told me she made nothing. You told me the house and the truck were the whole picture." Ethan didn't answer. He opened his laptop instead, hands shaking slightly, and typed my name into a search bar for what he later admitted was the first time in 6 years of marriage. What came back stopped him cold. A patent filing my name listed as co-inventor alongside my late uncle. A brief mention in a defense industry trade publication about a small firm's board additions following a contract win. A short bio on an alumni page from a fellowship program I'd completed years earlier, describing systems work that had nothing to do with the woman he thought he'd been married to. None of it was dramatic. None of it was flashy. It was just quietly, undeniably real years of my actual life laid out in black and white, available the entire time to anyone who'd cared enough to look. He sat there, he told me later, staring at the screen until the words blurred, feeling something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the sudden sickening understanding of how little he had actually known the person he'd shared a bed with for 6 years. He picked up his phone and called me. I looked at the screen, watched his name light up against the dark, and let it ring until it went to voicemail. He called 4 more times that night. I watched the screen light up each time from across my kitchen, the phone buzzing softly against the counter like something trying to get my attention that I had already decided didn't deserve it. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this part of the story like a victory lap, and it wasn't. It was quieter than that, sadder in some ways. I just felt the strange, hollow calm of watching a house of cards finally catch the wind it had been standing against for years. I found out most of what happened next the way everyone else did through the slow, unglamorous decay of a life built on assumptions visible in fragments, through mutual friends, old co-workers, and eventually Ethan himself. Vanessa unraveled first and fastest. She had married a version of Ethan that existed mostly in his own telling of himself, successful ascending a man on the verge of the kind of wealth that would let her stop worrying about the things she'd grown up worrying about. When that version started coming apart, she didn't handle it with grace. She started asking questions in front of other people at dinners at the gym in a way that made their mutual friends deeply uncomfortable. "Did you know he lied about the divorce settlement?" She reportedly asked one of Ethan's college friends at a birthday party loud enough that 3 other people heard it, and within a week so had I. The whispers moved fast in the tight little social circle they shared. People began quietly comparing notes, noticing for the first time how much of Ethan's confidence had always rested on a story about money that had never quite added up if you looked closely. Old friends who had once toasted his second marriage at the vineyard started finding reasons to be busy when he called. It wasn't dramatic or cruel mostly. It was just the slow social erosion that happens when people realize they've been sold a version of someone that didn't exist. Financially, things moved even faster than socially. The refinance on the house fell through entirely once the bank finished its review, and without it, Ethan couldn't cover the balloon payment structure he and I had originally set up years earlier under very different financial assumptions. He tried to sell the house instead, but the market had shifted since we bought it, and after months of it sitting with barely any interest, he was forced to list it nearly $40,000 under what we'd paid. The Denali, the one he'd been so proud to keep from our marriage, needed almost $6,000 in transmission repairs he no longer had easy access to fund, not with legal fees from the loan dispute stacking up and credit card balances from a wedding that had been, by every account, I heard considerably more expensive than either of them could actually afford. Carl Denning's withdrawal from the Richmond deal had a ripple effect Ethan hadn't anticipated in an industry that runs on relationships and reputation word travels through exactly the kind of small interconnected circles that had once made Ethan's career possible. 2 other potential deals quietly stalled out over the following months, not through any direct accusation, but through the kind of soft, unspoken hesitation that settles over a person once their credibility has been publicly questioned. He kept working, kept showing up to open houses with the same easy smile, but something in the confidence had shifted, and clients can sense that kind of thing even when they can't name it. Vanessa's frustration curdled into something sharper as the months went on. I heard through the same network of mutual acquaintances that had once passed me photos of their wedding that she'd started saying things to him in front of people that weren't meant to be repeated but were anyway. "You ruined my life," she reportedly told him at a dinner party that ended early and awkwardly, the kind of sentence that lands heavier in front of witnesses than it would have in private. I don't know if that's exactly what she said. I only know that the story reached me from 3 separate sources within the same week, which told me something about how visible the cracks in their marriage had already become. I want to be clear that I took no pleasure in hearing any of it. There's a particular kind of sadness in watching a life you were once part of collapse from the outside, even when the person at the center of it caused his own downfall. I remembered the man Ethan had been at 28, hungry and funny and genuinely kind in the early years, before ambition curdled into entitlement, before he decided my worth could be measured entirely by a number on a pay stub. Some nights, hearing another piece of the story secondhand, I felt something closer to grief than satisfaction. Grief for the marriage that could have been, if he'd ever once been curious enough to really know me. But I didn't call him. I didn't reach out to offer comfort or clarity or anything at all. I let him sit inside the consequences of a life he'd built on assumptions, because that was the only education left that might actually reach him. While all of that was unfolding around him, my own life moved forward in a much quieter rhythm. I finished my physical therapy program in 11 weeks, a full month ahead of what the doctors had projected, mostly through sheer stubbornness, and the kind of discipline the Army had spent over a decade drilling into me. I returned to my unit on modified duty, easing back into the work I'd built my whole adult identity around. I sat in on a defense technology conference in Huntsville as a board observer for my uncle's old company, listening to engineers half my age talk about systems I'd helped shape years earlier, feeling something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with Ethan at all, a sense that my life, the actual substance of it, had never needed his belief in it to be real. Then on a Tuesday evening in early spring, almost 5 months after the divorce papers first landed in my hospital room, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Ethan's name sat above it on the screen, and beneath it a small number I hadn't seen attached to his contact in years. 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. I stared at it for a long moment before I finally pressed play. His voice on the recording didn't sound like the man who'd stood at the foot of my hospital bed with a folder under his arm. It sounded smaller. Tired in a way I hadn't heard from him even in our worst years together. "Rachel," he started, and then there was a long pause, long enough that I almost thought the message had cut off. "I don't even know what to say that doesn't sound like an excuse. I know I don't deserve you calling me back. I need you to know I know now. I know what I did, I know what I threw away, and I'm not talking about the house." He kept going, his voice catching in places, admitting things in fragments that he'd been ashamed to call his own father about the loan situation, that Vanessa had moved in with her sister 2 weeks earlier, that he'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in his life, not because he wanted to, but because he genuinely didn't understand how he'd become a person who could stand in a hospital room and hand his wife divorce papers instead of asking if she was in pain. He said my name 3 more times in the message, each time a little quieter, like he was testing whether it still meant anything for him to say it. I listened to the whole 4 minutes and 12 seconds twice before I decided anything. Then I called Diane, not for legal advice this time, just to talk it through the way you talk something through with someone who's watched the whole story unfold from the very beginning. She listened, and then she asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want to see him?" I sat with that question for 3 days before I had an answer. Not because I was afraid of him anymore, there was nothing left in me that feared Ethan Morgan, no leftover tenderness sharp enough to hurt. I took the time because I wanted to be sure that if I agreed to meet him it would be for the right reason, not to gloat, not to let him see what he'd lost laid out in front of him like a trophy. I agreed to meet him because I realized somewhere in that quiet stretch of days that I still had one thing left to say, and I owed it to myself to say it out loud rather than let it sit unspoken forever. We met on a Thursday afternoon at a small coffee shop in Old Town Neutral Ground, the kind of place neither of us had any history with. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, and I almost didn't recognize him at first. He'd lost weight. Not in the deliberate, gym-honed way he used to talk about at dinner parties, but in the tired, sleepless way that comes from stress eating away at a person from the inside. He stood up when he saw me, and for a second, neither of us said anything at all. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice rougher than I remembered. I sat down across from him, ordered nothing, and let him talk first because I could see he needed to get it out before he lost his nerve. He cried eventually, somewhere in the middle of it, not the performative kind of crying I might have expected from him once, but something quieter, more involuntary, like it surprised even him. He told me he was sorry, that he understood now how badly he'd failed to see me, that he'd let a number on a pay stub become the entire measure of my worth, because it was easier than actually asking who I was underneath the uniform. He said Vanessa had used him almost as much as he'd used his own assumptions about me, that once the money didn't materialize the way she expected, she'd made it very clear what she'd actually married him for. He said it without much bitterness, mostly just exhaustion, like a man recounting a fever dream he was finally waking from. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't offer the comfort of forgiveness before he'd earned the space to say what he needed to say. When he was done, when the silence between us had stretched long enough that the barista 2 tables over had refilled our neighbor's coffee twice, I finally spoke, and I kept my voice even without a trace of triumph in it. "I didn't lose a marriage because I made less money, Ethan," I said. I lost one because you never cared enough to actually know me. He flinched at that, more than he had at anything the banks or the lawyers or Carl Denning had told him in the months before. I think some part of him had hoped, walking into that coffee shop, that this conversation would end with some kind of financial reconciliation, some acknowledgement on my part of what he'd lost in dollar terms. I made sure that was never on the table. I hadn't come to talk about money. I'd never once in this entire ordeal needed him to know exactly what I was worth in numbers. What I needed him to understand, what I think finally in that small coffee shop he actually did understand, was that the real loss had nothing to do with a stake in a defense company or a set of patents. It was the years he'd spent standing next to a woman he never bothered to truly meet. I reached into my bag and set a plain envelope on the table between us. Inside were copies of the original divorce papers, the same ones he'd handed me in that hospital room, along with a short handwritten note I'd drafted the night before, the kind of note that doesn't ask for anything back. I wasn't giving him closure out of forgiveness exactly. I was giving it to myself, closing a door I'd been holding half open in some quiet corner of my mind since the moment he walked in with that folder under his arm. I hope you figure out who you actually want to be. I told him, standing up before either of us could turn the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. I mean that. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't need one. I walked out of that coffee shop into the ordinary brightness of a Thursday afternoon, past people going about lives that had nothing to do with mine, and I didn't look back over my shoulder the way people do in movies when they want to see if the other person is watching them leave. I already knew he was. It didn't matter anymore. Nearly a year passed after that afternoon before Ethan Morgan crossed my path again, and when he did, neither of us was expecting it. A year is a long time when you spend it rebuilding instead of grieving. By the time the invitation arrived, a formal card, embossed lettering, and evening reception hosted by a National Defense Innovation Council, I almost didn't recognize the woman it was addressed to. Major Rachel Morgan, recipient of a commendation for contributions to next-generation logistics systems work that had grown directly out of the patents my Uncle Frank had left me, work I'd spent the better part of a decade quietly building alongside my actual career, the one nobody ever needed to see the dollar signs behind to understand. I almost didn't go. Ceremonies like that had never been my language. I'd spent my whole adult life more comfortable in a briefing room than a ballroom, more at ease giving orders under pressure than accepting applause under chandeliers. But my old physical therapist, who'd become something like a friend over the 11 weeks of recovery, talked me into it over coffee one Sunday morning. "You don't owe anyone humility forever, Rachel," she said. "Let people see what you built." So I went. I wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry beyond my late mother's small gold earrings, and I stood in a hotel ballroom in Arlington, surrounded by generals, engineers, defense contractors, and colleagues who had known me only through the quiet, steady version of my